We are in Mark chapter 7. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with their hands that were, quote unquote, unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they have had their hands ceremonially washed, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Pause there for a second. It's noteworthy, and I'm grateful for Mark, knowing that we, as non-Jewish readers, are going to need some helpful background material, that he's not assuming that we are very familiar with first century Jewish culture, and that as non-Jews, Gentiles, we need a little coaching from time to time. And so he provides us these asides that says, oh, in case you don't know why this is about to become a problem, here's what was going on behind the scenes. I'm very grateful for these little notes that the gospel writers tucked in. So verse 5. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating food with unclean hands? He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. So you know how sometimes Jesus gets a reputation as being like basically Mr. Rogers with a beard? I don't know if you've ever noticed that. He basically is just a really nice guy who tells children to be nice to each other. Like that's sometimes the hallmark version of Jesus that comes to us. One of the really valuable things about taking time to actually read the scriptures is that you encounter a very different Jesus. So when they come and they ask Jesus, hey, why don't your disciples do this? Keep in mind, and I don't know if you're like this at all, but when you're doing something that you know others disapprove of, or that others have asked you not to do, or that you know would offend them, or, right, that's gonna step on their toes, sometimes you have an anticipatory, that is not usually there. All right, note to self, don't walk backwards. If you have an anticipatory thing, like if you're doing something and you know, like you hear, let's say you hear your mom come home, and you know that when she comes in, she sees what you're doing in the kitchen, and she's gonna be like, why are you doing that? So you sort of anticipate it, and you get your hackles up a little bit ahead of time. Jesus knows this question is coming, and let's just name, he could have been a little more gracious with this response. This is the response of somebody, I'm not saying he was looking for a fight or he's trying to pick a fight, but he knew one was coming. And so his answer is not the most gracious. He says, Isaiah's their guy, right, their prophet. Isaiah was right about you when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Well, that's a low blow. That's quoting our guy against us. I mean, that's just getting off on the wrong foot, right? You're asking for a fight. And then he quotes. So one of the things we have committed to do as we read through the Gospel of Mark is that anytime it quotes the Old Testament, we have committed to turn back and read that passage in context. So we got to go back to Isaiah here. Oh, by the way, if you're in Mark here, if you look down, it says Isaiah 29:13. So we're actually going to turn back. If you're turning with me, it's page 1102. And so if you're turning to Isaiah 29, one of the things you're going to see is that the publishers of this version of our Bible have entitled this section, Woe to David's City. That is Jerusalem. And in our Mark story, these religious leaders have come out from Jerusalem, right? So this is the tie-in. And so Jesus knows what he's doing when he quotes Isaiah 29. And in verse 13, he says, the Lord says, these people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is made up only of rules taught by men. Therefore, once more, I will astound these people with wonder upon wonder, and wisdom of the wise will perish. The intelligence of the intelligent will vanish. Woe to those who go to the great depths to hide their plans from the Lord, who do their work in darkness and think, who sees us and who will know? You turn things upside down as if the potter were thought to be like the clay. Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, he did not make me? Can the pot say of the potter, he knows nothing? In a very short time will not Lebanon be turned into a fertile field, and the fertile field seem like a forest? When Jesus quotes the Old Testament, you have to be very careful, because he's like somebody who knows a movie well and will pull out a really thin line, and unless you know the context or like the movie that it's from, you won't get the reference, right? Like he'll say, leave the gun, take the cannoli. You'll say, I'm sorry, what? There's no gun, there's no cannoli, right? But what you need to know is that's from The Godfather. It means understand where you're going, don't go for a fight, right? You'd have to know something about The Godfather to catch the reference. At Christmas, we did this when we were reading, we did this with Taylor Swift lyrics. You have to know the context, right? The title of the song in order to get the reference. That's how Jesus is with the Old Testament. So when he quotes the prophet Isaiah here, he picks two very small passages that don't seem that offensive. But his listeners, his combatants, would have known that that is from a passage where God is reprimanding the people and threatening them with exile. They would have known what's up. And that one little passage that Jesus doesn't quote here in Mark, but that they would have known as in Isaiah, says, God knows what you're up to behind the scenes. He sees what you're plotting in the dark. This is a foreshadowing that these people are trying to trap Jesus so that they can arrest and kill him. And they would have known that passage in Isaiah backwards and forward. They would have caught the reference. You and I would have missed it. Jesus is calling them out, saying, don't talk to me about washing your hands. You're plotting my death, and you think you honor God. Right? So he's not pulling his punches here. So he goes on in verse 8. You have let go the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father and mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is korban, that is, a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition and that you have handed down. And you do many things like that. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand, nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it's what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull, he asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can make them unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Stop for a side note here. Mark is writing this during the period of what we would know as the book of Acts. And one of the things that happens in the book of Acts, from Acts chapter 10 to Acts chapter 15, is that the Jewish leaders of the early churches are trying to figure out if Gentiles have to become Jewish before they can become Christian. They couldn't figure that out initially, and they're trying to sort it out. And in one of these stories, God comes to the Apostle Peter and gives him a vision of all of these animals that he's not to touch or eat on this sheet. And Peter, in his typically robust way, says, I want nothing to do with this. And in the vision, the Lord declares all of those animals clean. And so the church makes a decision about how we participate in dietary law. So Mark throws in this little note, not because it happened in the story, but because it would become important later when he was writing. I just think that's interesting. All right, we'll finish up here. He went on, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of a man's heart comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. I want you to hear how radical it is for Jesus to say it's not the stuff outside you need to worry about. It's what's going on inside. This is a radical perspective because so much of what gets called religion, and I want to be careful because passages like this have historically been used against Jews, against the Jewish community, okay? But I want to point out the hypocrisy of that because this is not only an anti-Jewish warning, let's be honest, this is an anti-Christian warning. Christians have more rules about behaviors and purity codes and dietary things and alcohol and dancing and movies. I grew up in what was called the holiness tradition. We had so many rules of what we could and couldn't do. Like we actually had a little slogan. We said, I don't drink, or I don't smoke. How did it go? I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't date girls that do. Something like that. Chew. That's what I was missing. Thank you. I appreciate that, Gail. You get a bonus point. Gold star. Yeah, it was just really weird. Like we even had, we had jokes, like I can't tell some of them here, but that made fun of the hypocrisy of this kind of rule keeping. So, both for Jewish law and for Christian rules-based religion, what Jesus is saying here is radical. It's not what's outside of you that can make you unclean. It's the stuff that's already there that gets expressed. That's what you need to be concerned about. So, in the past few years, I have learned a very valuable lesson from the field of psychology, which is that things that are repressed often get expressed somewhere else. It's one of the dangers of trying to repress something, whether it's a prohibition against alcohol or purity culture with sexuality for our young people or whatever it is. When something is repressed, it will often pop up somewhere else that is worse. Whatever you're trying to address, you can actually make the problem far worse by trying to control this. It's like the whack-a-mole game, and you think you have this under control, but what you don't know is that the pressure's building up underneath the surface, and it's gonna pop up somewhere else. This is true both in people's lives. It's also true in communities of faith, in like religious communities, and in social environments like cities. You have to really account for and attend to that which is repressed in one area will often get expressed in a less helpful area. That's a good thing to know because when Jesus says this to the Pharisees, we have the gift of being sort of onlookers, of hearing it secondhand, but it can become for us an invitation to live a different way. Like, what would be the difference if you and I, in our families, whether it's raising children, or in communities like this, or in our larger web of relationships, if we constantly put in front of each other the reminder that the behavior is a secondary manifestation of something else happening below the surface. Because it's so easy to focus on behaviors, and it's so tricky to get behind them to motivations. My parents were very creative people. They were sort of Woodstock hippies. My dad was a dairy farmer before he got his call to ministry. And so when they left behind, they sold the farm and they moved down to train at a college in Georgia, because that's where their pastor had trained. They moved down to Georgia. They encountered, when you cross the Mason-Dixon line, they encountered something, a kind of Christianity. Some people call it the Bible Belt. A different kind of Christianity down in Georgia that was more fundamentalist than they were used to. And my parents had to navigate what life was going to look like raising a young family when the social expectations were that kids should be well behaved. But you, because of genetics, had kids that had a lot of energy and creativity. So trying to navigate that was, in what ways do we want to foster an environment where our kids are well behaved and don't embarrass us in public, and at the same time, that we bring out the best of them and their passions and live into their full heart. And it was tricky for them to do that in the religious environment that we lived in. There were a lot of influences, like if you've heard of James Dobson's Focus on the Family and other things that were really trying to get kids, to conform and be in this box. But my parents' hippie heart, their Woodstock, wanting us to be carefree and be the best version of ourselves, they were constantly navigating this. Well, I had the pleasure of being the oldest in my family, so I was the guinea pig. And they would let me know it's important how you do this, Bo, because your younger siblings are watching. No pressure, right? But then I hit the teenage years, and I went from being a fairly, lighthearted, sort of fluffy kid who was pretty sheltered from the world. And all of a sudden, I grew 6 inches in 8 months. I got muscles. Girls started to notice me, and other guys started to be afraid of me. And so my whole life changed in about a 1-year window. My parents realized that their parenting style had to change as well, because we had entered into an unknown territory of the teenage boy. And we tried a couple things that didn't go well. So my parents finally came to this idea, and it turned out to be a genius move. They said, we don't want to argue with you about things like curfew, right? That's not how we want to spend our time. So here's how we're going to do it. We want to teach you principles to live by and then let you practice them. Sometimes you're going to get them right and sometimes you're not, but there's going to be consequences. For instance, you can stay out as late as you want. And I went, yes. He said, but, because my dad was a farmer, he said, you have to get up first call the next morning or you're grounded the next weekend. Interesting, right? Because what they wanted to do is get away from the external things, like what time it said on the clock. And they wanted me to learn how to be responsible, how to get myself home, how to give myself enough rest, right? How to make choices with my friends. If my friends were going and they were going to stay out later, but I knew that I needed to get home, they're trying to teach me responsibility. And it worked sometimes, but I will never forget, in the spring of my senior year, I stayed out way too late. In fact, I think I'd only been home like an hour before they knocked on the door. And we were supposed to be gardening because it was in the spring. And I'm dead asleep. I mean, I've been out having a lot of fun till like 4 a.m, and I've just crawled into bed, and it was like 7, and there's the knock on the door, and I don't get up. So it's the moment of consequence, right? So my dad came in with cold water, dumped it on me in bed, and said I was grounded the following weekend, which happened to be prom, and I was furious. But my parents held the line and said, who made the decision to stay out? So you knew that it was the next weekend, your girlfriend has already bought the dress, and yet you decided to stay out till that late in the morning, right? That's an important lesson as a young person. I was given the freedom, right, from these external things. But there was a motivation inside, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I was responsible for, right, making these choices. I love my parents for doing experiments like this, because when I compare notes with my other friends who were raised religious, they would often be punished by things like, if they broke curfew, they'd have to sit in their room and read their Bible. Like, what a terrible punishment, right? But also because the gift of passages like this says there's a different way to live, which isn't afraid of the outside world, which isn't living in the anxiety that you might get polluted by what someone else does or by what you might take in. But it's an invitation to really look at your own heart and say, what's going on in there? Why is this even tempting to you? Why is this so weighty in your life that it pulls on you? So I want to confess something. As a Christian minister, one of the critiques of Christianity that stings the most is when, from time to time, somebody will point out that what we have in the West, in American Christianity, is not the religion of Jesus. It's a religion about Jesus. And that might seem like a minor, like a technicality or just verbiage to you. But I want you to hear what Jesus says. It's nothing outside of you that can make you unclean. It's the stuff that comes out of you. That's the religion of Jesus. But so much of Western Christianity is external rules-based and purity codes, doctrinal statements, all of these external things that get us away from the heart of love that Jesus is inviting us to. The religion of Jesus is very different than the religion about Jesus. And I just need to name that. Because when I come face to face with this radical statement that it's nothing outside of you that can make you unclean, let's talk about what's going on in your heart. That's the religion of Jesus. And that's not what I was raised in. And it's not often how, when I participate in religious conversations, what people mean when they talk about Christianity or about religion. So I want to give you an insight that I've learned from a psychotherapist, in the realm of psychology. He was a psychoanalytic philosopher. His name was Jacques Lacan. And of his many insights, the one that I am most fascinated with when it comes to topics like this is he uses the example that if a man is suspicious that his wife is cheating on him, and he is obsessed, right, with that she's cheating, Lacan's insight is it doesn't matter whether she's cheating or not, whether she has cheated before. The issue at hand is his obsession, right? If somebody's cheating on you, right, they've clearly moved into a different part of the relationship, and the relationship, right, is what it is, the reality of that. That's not in question. The question is about the obsession. This really came home to me when I had a friendship fall apart. When I would see that friend succeeding in areas that I no longer had access to, I was furious. I was so angry about how our friendship had fallen apart. I blamed him, and it drove me crazy that not only was he the one that ruined what we had, but that he benefited from it in the area that I most wanted success. And that jealousy ate at me. Now, thank God that after my mom died, my father paid for grief therapy. And my therapist would always ask me, why does this upset you so much? And I'd say, what am I paying you for? Don't you hear what I'm saying? He did this, and now he's succeeding over there where I can't. What are you not getting? The therapist would say, no, I understand. I've heard the story 100 times. My question is, why are you so upset? And it was so hard for me to come around and realize how much easier it was to focus on the external things, like who had said what and who thought this was going to happen and why, right? The external things. And what I did not want to look at is what was going on inside of me. Why did that hurt so much? Why was I so embarrassed? Why did it bring out this kind of venom and vitriol? It was so much easier to point the finger at external stuff. But the invitation of Jesus is, what's going on in there, buddy? What's going on that brings this out of you? Even if that person is doing something they shouldn't, why are you so obsessed with it? Why do you care that much? Why does it bring out this kind of emotion from you? And until you're ready to deal with that, you're gonna have to hide behind your religious facade of liturgical colors and, right, and stained glass and pipe organs and the liturgy and washing things, right, and gluten-free bread at communion so it doesn't taint the cup, right, you can get concerned about all that stuff. But until you deal with what's going on inside, we haven't even begun. It's a radical religion that Jesus had, and the invitation is still before us. It's nothing outside of you that can make you unclean. Let's talk about what's going on inside. I'm going to ask Brenda to play us a little music, give you time to process whatever thoughts are going on with you. If you have any questions, you can write them down on the bottom of the sermon outline. If you have any for me, you can write them on the yellow card and put them in the offering plate after the service. But let's take time to reflect together.